Thank you for listening to this download of Start the Week, presented by Anne McElvoy.
Hello. King Lear had a modest proposal for dealing with the tensions of power. We have divided in three our kingdom, he declares, to shake all cares and business from our age. It doesn't exactly turn out like that. But what are the lessons from our own history and other cultures for countries toying with dissolving national ties, like Scotland facing its independence vote later this year, or as the Lords broods over the referendum bill, for those tempted to spurn another union, in this case the European one? Round the table to tease apart these disunities are Linda Colley, prize-winning historian, who presents a new Radio 4 series on the rifts and resolutions of UK history. The Times foreign correspondent, David Charter, who's looked at what might await us if we do say adieu to the EU. David Pilling, who's written about another distinctive island and its quirks, Japan in his case, and the academic Maria Delgado, who is, among other things, interested in Catalonia's revived push to say adios to rule from Madrid. Linda, when James VI of Scotland inherited the throne of England in 1603, he argued that geography had preordained political union. Was this just the first fiction of many to fit convenient facts?
There have been many fictions over the centuries. When I started this series, out of which the book emerged, I really wanted to do three things. I wanted to offer, in necessarily compressed form, some background information, not least so that people could, I hope, make better sense of some of the fractures and challenges now confronting what is still the UK. I also wanted to talk about the multiple unions over the centuries. People often talk about this being an old country, but what country are they talking about? There have been acts of union with Wales, with Scotland, with Ireland. There have been dynastic unions with parts of Europe. There have been attempts to forge a Greater Britain. So I wanted to make clear how up and down and varied the history of these islands have been. And I also wanted to throw out finally some suggestions about possible futures for the Union, because whether Scotland secedes in September or no, there will need to be fresh thinking either about the UK or about what is left of the UK. So that was what I did at the end of the series, the end of the book.
And as you say throughout the book, and I'm sure we'll explore in the series, there are fictions which arise and then fall, and things are glued back together in different constellations. But these things can still be very important, can't they, to the way that people feel about things. So to your mind, what is more important? Is it geography or history that is destiny here?
Well, I'm a historian, so naturally I would say that history is more important. But it is the case that constitutive stories, as political scientists call them, are an important part of nation building, nation invention. We are not an island kingdom. There are thousands of islands in this particular mass, many of which have very discordant histories. But clearly the idea of being an island kingdom has been a very powerful one, and you can see it, for example, feeding into some UKIP lines of arguments even now. So constitutive ideas about the nation or the composite state don't need to be true in order to be very influential.
But also the island status gives you isolation, if you want to call it that or want to look at it that way, but it also gives you a bridge. You have to be a seafaring people. You have to go somewhere when you're on an island.
Absolutely, and for most of recorded human history, it's been much easier to travel by sea than by land. So the fact that these islands are surrounded by sea has in fact not cut them off. It's made them much more extrovert, as many other parts of the world have found out for their cost, of course.
Only to their cost?
Sometimes to their benefit, in some cases in trade, in new ideas. But ours has been, and I speak of England, Wales, Scotland and Ireland, these countries have not just fought each other at different stages, they've also been engaged in various forms of assertion and aggression in different parts of the globe.
I must say, one thing I learnt along the way was that John of Gaunt, who of course gives the famous speech, This England, and Shakespeare's great rousing patriotic speech, was in fact Belgian-born. This seemed in a strange way distressing, possibly with a future role in the European Commission. Maria Delgado, this idea of the island being both isolated but linked by the need to use the sea to connect with other parts of Europe and other parts of the world, how much do you think that influences the idea of culture as well as geopolitics?
Well, I think it's very difficult, as Linda said, to think about culture without thinking about its relationship with the cultures that whatever we think of as Britain has engaged with. If we think about Shakespeare, who's seen as the quintessential English or British dramatist, depends what position you're looking from. I mean, Shakespeare's language is full of resonances of Latin, of Spanish, of Germanic terms. I think it was Borges who talked about him as the most Spanish of writers. And the Irish have often said, actually, Shakespeare, it's a myth, he's English, he's actually Irish. So the ways in which, Shakespeare, somebody we think of as quintessentially English, actually the roots can be traced back to a series of languages and terms that come from beyond the British Isles.
What about modern cultural institutions, though? Because one thing that this discussion does throw up, particularly if we look at possible separations or greater separations between England and Scotland, is where does this leave ideas of kind of national culture? The National Theatre of Great Britain, as it was when it was founded, seemed to be something that was reflecting the culture of the whole of Britain. Now there's also a National Theatre of Scotland, albeit not in one building, but a theatre so-called without walls.
Devolution obviously allowed people or encouraged people to think about their sense of national identity. Where are we from? Where do we come from? What binds us together? And I think that the National Theatre of Great Britain was a product of the post-war era. Really, in many ways, it can be traced back to the 18th and 19th century. So if you think about the origins of the National Theatre, the idea of a National Theatre for Great Britain were being debated in the 19th century at the time when the British Museum's reading room was founded. There was talk about having and the National Gallery was founded. So in the 1830s and 1850s, there was talk then of having a national theatre in Bloomsbury. And in fact, the site was bought in 1913. As our ideas of culture shifted, and the idea of how can we use culture in the post-war era to give us a sense of national identity, especially following the traumas of World War II. And if you think about the National Theatre was a product of post-Second World War, but also at the same time as Avignon and the Edinburgh festivals came into being. So it was about culture binding people together on a national or European level.
Well, it's interesting Maria mentions the impact of war there, Linda. There is an argument that too much peaceful coexistence actually leads you to take more risks with potentially wanting to fracture yourself or split off, and that independence movements are a bit of a product of that.
Yes, and I mean, what's just been said, I think, is very interesting. And one of the questions it raises is how far can people amalgamate different identities? Because I don't necessarily think that different national theatres in the UK dictate fragmentation. Not at all. In the 19th century, after all, Scots raised enormous money to celebrate William Wallace, the great patriot Scottish hero who fought against the English. And in the long 19th century, most Scots felt that they could be very aggressively Scottish in their culture while also being British in their culture. And so this is the question: how far can people see themselves with identities like Russian dolls, with different layerings? And sometimes they can, sometimes these different layers fall apart.
It's often used, isn't it, as a metaphor, the Russian doll, but one is still on the outside. There's one that you project to the world as well as the little one on the inside.
Or you may project different ones in different circumstances.
David Pilling, you've covered Japan for many years and written about that. There's a very contrasting island nation, but is there some kind of shared island mentality that you find to give common ground when you come back to Blighty?
Well, sometimes when you're in a cab in Tokyo, people will look knowingly at you and say "Shimaguni desu ne," which means island nation. You come from an island nation too. But the way that Japan has used its island status, if used is the right word, is not so much as a bridge. Remember that Japan was virtually closed during the period of Sakoku, during the shogunate from the 17th century. And Japan very much closed itself off. It banned ships that could travel large distances, and it used its island status as a way of building really this myth of Japan as a monocultural, mono-ethnic nation, which was then built on even further after the Meiji Restoration of 1868.
No, I mean, what about the period you've been there? You're not based there now, you're based in Hong Kong, but you've been there in the last few years. And when we compare the sort of modernity of these two island countries, do you feel that there are similarities other than your taxi driver quipping about it?
Well, Japan, I think, still feels very separate. If you look at, the countries that are close to Japan, or close-ish, Japan is, of course, much further off the coast of the continental mass than Britain is. 120 miles from South Korea, 500 miles from China. So Japan feels much further away in that sense.
Yes. I mean, Linda, when you hear these comparisons, I mean, we look at different ways in which one might come to terms with the revived unities and disunities. I know you haven't set out to put a political manifesto in your book about what should happen to the UK, but what kind of changes are suggested by where we are now in terms of our sovereignty questions?
One of the many things I liked about this wonderful book about Japan was the stress on how benevolent disasters could be, how paradoxically you might think polities could gain strength from these disasters, being on the losing side in World War II, this terrible weather disaster, considerable disruption at the end of the 19th century. It could be that one of the things that is causing problems for the UK is precisely in some ways its apparent stability. There has been no revolution since the 17th century outside of Ireland. The last major lost war was the end of the 18th century.
That sounds like making a problem out of something that's actually
but
rather
actually,
good.
Look at Spain. I mean, Spain. I think Javier Cercas, the novelist, has talked about 50 coups d'états in 200 years. So Spain has had a tumultuous kind
That's
of...
at the other end of the spectrum, really,
other end
isn't
of
it?
the spectrum. I mean, and a recent and terrible dictatorship. And yet it is also beset by a number of problems around a sense of identity and where it is and where it wants to be.
We'll come back to Spain shortly, but David Charter, your last book, Au revoir, Europe, quoted one of David Cameron's speeches. It is a precious thing. It is about our history, our values, our shared identity, our joint place in the world. He's talking there about the United Kingdom in the light of the upcoming Scottish referendum, now rather closer than when he said it. But you do question why no British politician now talks about Europe in those terms as precious or valued.
That's right. And coming back to the island question, it's one of the things that Cameron made a great play of in his big speech about the European Union, that Britain had the mentality of an island nation, that our geography shapes our psychology. And I think what he was really talking about there was this feeling of independence that we have from the continent, and was really being polite about not mentioning the historical reasons, which is basically we won the war. And he does. It's not polite for Cameron to mention this in a speech about the European Union, but this has conditioned our whole...
You can see that might not be a good opening line. But
this has conditioned our whole response
you're also
to
reflecting
the European
that
Union.
there was a sense of never really wanting to say, we value this membership, we value, as Linda's example of the Russian doll identity, that a European identity is part of it, or at least for some people is part of being British, but it's kind of avoided by the political class.
We've never really embraced the idea that we are citizens of Europe or citizens of the EU, which was something that was introduced in the Maastricht Treaty, of course. And it was this reluctance to be part of Europe that is fundamentally caused our problems with our relationship, because it meant that we didn't really believe that Europe would come to exist as an entity when it was first considered, when it first got going. We avoided taking part at the start, and we allowed the other countries to set it up in a way that wasn't really conducive to the British view of how an intergovernmental organisation should work. And so by the time we came around to the idea, through pragmatic reasons, that we should take part, because our economy was in crisis, the Commonwealth was no longer functioning as a market for us to do business with, and Europe was booming. We weren't really able to accept that we had a European destiny out of a passion for Europe, but out of a pragmatism to sort of save our economy.
Yet being late to the table is just one aspect of it, isn't it? Because there does seem to be a rather consistent, visceral dislike of it in some quarters, refracted through the politics. And as you in today, we're just spending the weekend digesting the impact of 95 Conservative MPs suggesting blocking EU legislation if they think that it isn't in the UK's interests. So what's the right response to that?
Well, that comes back to the sovereignty question, and those MPs have never accepted the fundamental idea that makes Europe work, which is that we share our sovereignty with it. We pool our sovereignty. Edward Heath reassured us that we would retain our essential sovereignty. They didn't really explain which bit was essential and which bit wasn't essential, and which bit would be shared, and how that would work. But in the fine print, when we joined, we had a national veto over anything of any importance. But in order to make Europe work, it was Margaret Thatcher who abandoned the national veto and allowed the European system to be set up by majority voting. And that's what we agreed to do in order for it to become so important to our economic progress and create the single market, which so many Conservative MPs also say is the fundamental important aspect.
I must say, you're sounding very constructive. You report for The Times, which is somewhat Eurosceptically inclined newspaper. It's at one point even supported the referendum party. Why do you come out yourself on what the right way for this recalcitrant country to deal with the EU might be?
Well, it's a good question, of course, and I'm not...
I
haven't had the chip totally implanted from The Times, but the Europe, as seen from the continent, Britain already has a sweetheart deal with the European Union. We have a massive rebate on the money that we pay. We're not in the single currency. We have a lot of fiscal sovereignty that the others increasingly don't have, because they're trying to save the euro and they're doing lots of things to keep the euro. We actually have one of the best sort of deals that we could get, but the question is the British public relaxed, and will it accept having the degree of shared sovereignty that it takes for this deal to work?
David Pilley.
It's funny because despite what I said about Japan's relative isolation, from the distance of Asia, the European Union actually looks, in a political sense, quite attractive. When the European Union won the Nobel Peace Prize, one wag said, well, at least it wasn't given the prize for economics. But again, from Japan, the idea of kind of binding countries that had been at war together in some kind of institutional framework does not look bad. Japan has floated the idea, at very early stages, but of shared currency, of shared sort of institutions on which they could build.
Yeah, one would have to say to them, be careful about the terms on which you sign up after the last few somewhat inglorious years.
It's a non-starter anyway, but it is interesting that institutional vacuum that you have in Asia leads people to think of the EU and look at it through somewhat rose-tinted glasses.
Linda Colley.
Yeah, I much enjoyed your book, David, but I think we've got to be careful when we talk about we, Britain, what we think, because the EU, like so much else, can divide the different parts of the UK. People in Scotland, many people in Wales, people in Northern Ireland, and certainly people in the Republic of Ireland, are often more responsive, because for them the obvious enemy is not necessarily Brussels, it is much more likely to be London. So there's a different perception there. Even within England, a recent survey found that people in England who describe themselves as British are much less Eurosceptic, seemingly, than those who explicitly style themselves English.
Well, funny you should say that. It struck me at the end of Sherlock last night. But when he's... Look away now if you're going to watch it on catch-up. But when he is called back, and he says, "Who needs me?" And the answer is England. It is not Britain. I wondered whether there is now a linguistic shift away from people saying that they are British. If they're in England, I suppose, in Scotland, they would choose a different reply, or Northern Ireland or Wales.
I think England and Britain, unfortunately, have often been used as synonyms. But I do wonder if there is partly here a problem of Englishness, one aspect of which arguably is that England, unlike the other parts of the UK, does not have its own proprietorial assembly or parliament. And there's an imbalance here.
So, David, if we come back to what one might do out of this rather awkward marriage, a fractious marriage between Britain and the EU, there are other kinds of relationships that one could emulate. We could go the way of Norway or Switzerland, who have dealings with the EU but are not fully signed up members. They sign up to things like EFTA and to trade treaties and all sorts of whizzy things that allow them some rights and responsibilities in Europe but not all. What would be wrong with the a la carte approach for Britain?
If you're Norway, it's a good deal if you don't want so much EU control over aspects of your agriculture or trade, because that's all under your own control. But what you've done is you've signed up to take all the rules from Brussels without having a seat at the table and any say over how those rules are devised. Now, that might be acceptable to the British voting public in a referendum. They might say we'll get a large amount of control back from Brussels in exchange for handing over control actually of the single market so that we can stay in it. But if your problem is
such a bad deal to aim for, though? Boris Johnson, in his column in The Telegraph today, says this is the moment to stare down the barrel of an EU referendum because you might get a better deal out of it, and it's the only way, he suggests, to force a better deal. You get to keep the single market and you possibly might get some powers back, though whether they're enough to satisfy the 95 MPs and UKIP is another question. But what's wrong with that?
Well, I think it's a better deal than the Swiss arrangement, for example, where they've tried to have a free trade agreement and lots of treaties in different sectors to keep access as best as possible to the rest of Europe, but they haven't managed to do it in financial services. And of course this would be an utter disaster for the City of London, which generates so much of our GDP, if we're not able to have the normal free access for our financial services in Europe.
OK, let's be Norway then.
But Norway is a problem. If you've got a problem with the democratic deficit of Norway, not having a say, not having any MEPs, not having a commissioner, not having a judge at the European Court of Justice, and things that perhaps people don't understand about the single market is that a lot of the rules and regulations that really upset people flow from the single market. So the Working Time Directive, which is the 48-hour week, and lots of costs to business for paid holidays, flows from the single market. It's something that we would have to take part in and have to follow if we were Norway.
So there's quite a lot of unravelling of a cat's cradle to come. Maria Delgado, long before we get to the promised EU referendum, of course we have the Scottish referendum this year, and there are many regions in Europe watching that with particular interest. You've just come back from Catalonia in Spain, with its own calls for independence getting more insistent.
Absolutely, and the Catalan government, of course, has called a referendum for November 2014. So it's watching Scotland very carefully, a referendum that has been called illegal and unconstitutional by the Spanish government. We're seeing a Spanish nation. I mean, Spain has always, Linda's book talks about what do we understand by the British Isles. It's the same with Spain. I mean, Spain, nations are constructs that are formed for very complex reasons. And Catalonia had a long independent history, as did the Basque Country. So when democracy came into play following the death of Franco, Spain wrote a constitution, and a constitution that was about recognising the autonomy of the different areas of Spain without a federal structure, so to speak. So there's a degree of regional economic devolution, but power is very centrally concentrated in Madrid, and this is obviously resented by a Catalan government that has an unfavourable taxation system. So the taxes go to Madrid, and then Madrid gives back to Catalonia, and Catalonia gets less than it gives.
That's the meat and two veg, if you like, of the argument, or whatever the Spanish equivalent is possibly much more delicious. But how does this then get reflected? I know you specialise in culture, in film and theatre. There is a distinctive Catalonia culture. There's even a national theatre within a nation. How is that reflected in what is then served up in culture?
Well, national theatres sometimes come into being before the nation states that they purport to represent. So, you saw this in Germany in the 1760s, and there was a national theatre in Germany before there was a nation state in the way that we understand it. So national theatres can be about willing a nation state into being. They can be about fostering a sense of national identity, about promoting a sense of civic consciousness. So the Catalan National Theatre was established in 1997 to promote the idea of a Catalan heritage, a dramatic heritage, and a dramatic tradition that they hoped would kind of bind the nation together and stress, especially its linguistic difference to Castilian or what we term as Spanish. I think obviously the recession has had a huge part in actually fostering dissent and a sense of Catalans' sense of injustice, the way it's being managed by right-wing government in Madrid.
We opened the programme just with a quote of one of the most famous plays about divided kingdoms, King Lear. Sam Mendes' production is coming on at the National Theatre here in a few weeks. Does that idea of Shakespeare dealing with kingdoms sort of translate very naturally into the Spanish context?
Interestingly, King Lear is a play that hasn't been staged perhaps as often as one would think within the Spanish nation state. The first production of King Lear in Catalan only took place in 2004, which I think is perhaps part of a wider issue about Shakespeare in Spain and
so
in
the Spanish slow on the uptake.
But actually, what's interesting is that it was chosen in 2004 for the big Forum Festival in Barcelona as a play that was about the issues, the problems of governance. What happens when you have patriarchy that's out of control, when you have a ruler who doesn't rule with responsibility, a kind of despot. So in many ways it was a warning about Spain's past history, and also being staged both in Catalan and then in Castilian, about its future.
This is the director
Calixto Bieto,
who often uses old plays in modern context, often with a very strong message.
Yeah, and to use what he sees as part of a European dramatic heritage to probe issues that are facing Catalonia, Spain, and Europe in general. Who are we as nations within wider kind of confederations or wider organisational bodies? What does that mean? And how can we use culture to articulate some of the fault lines and issues of dissent in our society?
In the case of King Lear, do not try this at home. Linda Colley.
Yeah, I suppose one of the things I am slightly concerned about is the much broader context of this. All of Europe, not least the UK, contains stateless nations, many of which want their own state. And these are fault lines running throughout Europe, and of course not just in Europe. But we do face a challenge. This is a world where the great Asian economies, including, as we are reminded, Japan, are very, very powerful and becoming more so. There are these great territorial powers, the United States, Russia. I do think there's a problem if Europeans just study their navels over much and say, here's a cultural divide, there's a cultural divide, without thinking, well, OK, yes, we have many differences, but how do we get our act together? There is an argument that one of the things that the EU did wrong, and there are many things it did wrong, was get diverted into the euro before building up the more practical and power-based connections across this continent that arguably need to be built if we are going to function in a very uncertain world.
David Pilling will come to Asia specifically in a moment, Asia-Pacific, but there is a sort of argument, isn't there, that you should be in bigger power blocks. And yet countries don't seem to take that on board. They quite often do prefer to look to their own, as Linda would put it, to their own navel.
Well, that's right. Well, in Asia, of course, what the problem that you have is that the history of the Second World War still looms exceedingly large over Asia, especially Northeast Asia. And so the idea of somehow, pooling sovereignty or becoming closer together is really, as I said, a non-starter. You have leaders of Japan, China and South Korea that are literally not talking to each other. They literally will not meet. So the disunity that you have in Asia at the moment, really governed by the history of the Second World War, is extraordinary. I just wanted to make actually a quick point about King Lear and its resonance in Japan, which was slightly different. If you remember Kurosawa's film on King Lear, that really was not about the modern state breaking up. It was very much a historical look at Japan's warring states period, which in a sense shows that the myth of Japan as a unified nation is really rather strong. They talked instead about the three arrows, three being stronger than one, because you can't break three arrows if they're put together, which is interestingly a metaphor that's been taken up now by Shinzo Abe, the Prime Minister of Japan, to describe his economic policy. But the idea that this might describe Japan somehow sundering is not really resonant.
The message of Lear, Maria, might be just stop fretting and indulging yourself and keep the kingdom together. And Linda's point was that you might just do
or
better,
think
not
through the decisions that you make. I mean, Lear, he rushes into that decision. It's a decision of folly. And how far can we ask politicians not to rush into decisions, but to think through? And just one of the points Linda's book is making.
What about the idea that Spain's problems are much bigger, actually, than its internal constitution? And yet there is still this huge focus, I think you've said in a piece I saw you write, when you go to a football match in Barcelona and have this sort of Catalan sea of Catalan flags, does it ever occur to people that it might be better to focus more on Spanish national outlook rather than the specific?
Well, the problem with focusing on Spanish national identity, it was so marred by the dictatorship of Francisco Franco. So Franco used Spanish nationalism as a way of curtailing the identity of the Basques and the Catalans, who were not allowed to speak their language in public. Now that had huge implications on the ways in which those two nations, if you like, or regions thought about themselves. I mean, football, we looked at the end of the World Cup in 2010. Of course, Spain, the calls for independence were very small in Catalonia. Well, who knows what happens if Spain wins the World Cup in 2014? The referendum may not go the Catalans' way.
It's all in the hands of the goalkeeper, as so often. David Pilling, you've been reporting for the Financial Times from Japan. Now you're based in Hong Kong as Asia editor. When you called your book Bending Adversity, and it's quite interesting, isn't it, that even at the moment when Japan is seen to be a country that's gone through great economic adversity, it's no longer the kind of poster boy or poster girl that it used to be of the global economies, and yet it still has this specific mystique to it.
I guess it does, yes. I mean, I think that that can be a problem. I think it's something that's encouraged by the Japanese. One, of course, can't speak about the Japanese, but it's encouraged by many Japanese. And it's encouraged by many foreigners who look at Japan, who like to see it as uniquely unique. I mean, the Japanese like to see themselves as cooperative rice farmers, not garrulous hunter-gatherers. They like to see themselves as illogical, funnily enough, from the heart, soft, communal, not hard and logical like Westerners. This is a mythology of the kind of, which can turn Japan into a sort of Galapagos island, which I think is, in the long run, really rather unhelpful.
But culture, or at least what we tend to celebrate and know of Japanese culture in the West, also kind of helps that view of being different and a sort of discrete culture, does it? Whether it's no theatre, kabuki, sumo wrestling, even karaoke, one of the great Japanese exports, in which one cannot possibly put a price. How important do these things feel when you're there, as opposed to us looking at it from a great distance?
Well, they certainly are very important to Japan's identity, but I don't think we should exaggerate. I mean, I think the thing about Japan is that it was really the first non-European nation or European offshoot to become wealthy. So we tend to look at it as this aberration. But just if you conduct a thought experiment, imagine it was Thailand that had become, this incredibly fast-growing economy after the Second World War, producing electronics that we all used, seeming to threaten the United States with its economic power. We would be talking about the unique role of the Thai king and the unique cuisine.
It didn't work out
Thailand.
that way.
It didn't, but I think so. Japan is, of course, unique, as are all nations. But the idea that it is uniquely unique, which is something that does have a resonance, I think is something to be fought against.
You also question the idea of the Japanese salaryman and this rather rigid corporatist culture, which we might even in our less open-minded moments make jokes about. You think it's a much more adaptive and resilient society than that?
Well, indeed. I mean, if you take the labour market, for example, people, even Japan experts, often talk about the Japan labour market as being very rigid. In fact, it's proved itself extraordinarily flexible since the crash in 1990 and the subsequent downturn. Nearly 40% of Japanese workers are now part-time, contract workers, hours that even the rigid salaryman works have gone down as a sort of a buffer, as have wages to some extent. So, and as a result, unemployment has never reached the levels that you've seen in Europe or the United States.
Of course, the major events, seismic events, literally that have had a massive impact on Japan from 2011, the tsunami, and then the nuclear catastrophe at the Fukushima plant. I think it was Linda Colley who said earlier that sometimes you can get a bit landlocked by not having big challenges or indeed big national dramas. There's no shortage of those in Japan. How has that changed the country that you know? Well,
that's right. And I think that was a very interesting point, really, that Japan somehow takes succour from this idea of constant adversity, a volcano that's about to erupt, a tsunami that's about to hit. I mean, people talk about tsunamis as we talk about battles. So Japan, I think, has sort of mythologized itself as a nation that faces adversity that no other nation faces, and manages to gain a certain strength from that.
David Charter, it might also play into your thinking about the EU that fortunately in Europe, where on the whole we don't have, often a bit of flooding now and then, the odd thing that goes wrong, we don't have big natural disasters or the nuclear ones to contend with. So we tend to fight about peacetime.
Yeah, nor the threat of war, exactly. The tsunami in Japan had a big impact in Germany because they decided to scrap their nuclear power program, and that was a very good
example of globalization in practice.
A big and quite unexpected impact. But it's the absence of war, if you like. It's the absence of the threat of war in Europe that perhaps, as Linda has written as well, allows you almost the luxury of nationalism, and this nationalism we will see rearing its head in May during the European Parliament elections. And it was one question I had for David on Japan, really, was how big or how important is the nationalism and the nationalistic right? Because certainly in Germany that's never reared its head since the war.
David, Billy.
Yes, well, I think it's more important in Japan than it has been in Germany. There was something called the reverse course when the Americans were occupying Japan after the war, and the Americans really, I think, were more frightened of communism than they were of allowing some of the people who had taken Japan into sort of its colonial disastrous enterprise, allowing them back. The prime example being Kishi, of course, who was arrested as a potential A-class war criminal. Kishi is Abe's grandfather.
But you could argue that Japan got off pretty lightly on those grounds. It's impossible for a German politician of mainstream want to be strongly nationalist in this way. I mean, just having come back from China and looked at the arguments still about the Nanjing massacre and the refusal really to confess and to apologise for some of the atrocities that Japan committed.
Well, it's an interesting and very controversial topic. I mean, Japan has indeed apologised time after time after time. What is doubted is the sincerity of that apology. And when you have someone like Abe who does cast doubt over whether Japan invaded China or merely advanced into China, then no matter how many times you say sorry, people will say, well, I don't believe you.
It's a fine but important distinction. Linda Colley, do you find this war of words with China worrying?
Well, it's a reminder, of course, of what all these countries we've been talking about this morning have in common. They're all empires. Japan, after the Meiji Restoration, became very imperialistic, moving into Korea, ultimately into China. Spain, of course, the great empire in the early modern period. Britain, ultimately, the greatest empire in size, though for a very short time. And I think one of the challenges that all these places are confronting is how you adapt from being an empire with global or would-be global pretensions back to your own comparatively small boundaries.
And with Germany, of course, David was talking about this idea of a non-nationalism, but in many ways they've refracted that through a control of shaping the European Union in their image. So, on the one hand, you don't have German nationalism. On the other hand, you have a control of the European Union, which one could argue is a form of nationalism, displaced nationalism.
So, do we think that there is a channeling going on? Very briefly, what about Japan? Does it still feel like a former empire?
Well, actually, I wanted to talk about China, if I may, because...
No, I'm afraid you can't. Just on the Japanese...
Does Japan feel like a former empire? I would say no. I mean, history is clearly there, but Japan feels like an island.
Thank you to all my guests, Maria Delgado, Professor of Theatre and Screen Arts at Queen Mary's College, University of London. Linda Colley's Radio 4 series Acts of Union and Disunion continues at 1:45 weekdays for the next fortnight. David Pilling's Bending Adversity is out now, and David Charter's follow-up to last year's Au revoir Europe is Europe, in or out, and it'll be published in March so that you can find out or decide. Next week, happy days for Tom Sutcliffe as he asks whether our brains are in total control with Dick Schwab, Helen Dunmore, Natalie Abrahami and Julian Bagini. But for now, thank you and goodbye.
There are many more Radio 4 arts and discussion programmes to download for free. Find these on the website at bbc.co.uk/Radio 4.
Ideas about the nation or the composite state don't need to be true in order to be very influential.
But also the island status gives you isolation, if you want to call it that or want to look at it that way, but it also gives you a bridge. You have to be a seafaring people. You have to go somewhere when you're on an island.
Absolutely, and for most of recorded human history, it's been much easier to travel by sea than by land. So the fact that these islands are surrounded by sea has in fact not cut them off. It's made them much more extrovert, as many other parts of the world have found out for their cost, of course.
Only to their cost?
Sometimes to their benefit, in some cases in trade, in new ideas. But ours has been, and I speak of England, Wales, Scotland and Ireland, these countries have not just fought each other at different stages, they've also been engaged in various forms of assertion and aggression in different parts of the globe.
I must say one thing I learnt along the way was that John of Gaunt, who of course gives the famous speech, "This England, a fiction of many to fit convenient facts."
There have been many fictions over the centuries. When I started this series, out of which the book emerged, I really wanted to do three things. I wanted to offer in necessarily compressed form some background information, not least so that people could, I hope, make better sense of some of the fractures and challenges now confronting what is still the UK. I also wanted to talk about the multiple unions over the centuries. People often talk about this being an old country. But what country are they talking about? There have been acts of union with Wales, with Scotland, with Ireland. There have been dynastic unions with parts of Europe. There have been attempts to forge a Greater Britain. So I wanted to make clear how up and down and varied the history of these islands have been. And I also wanted to throw out finally some suggestions about possible futures for the Union, because whether Scotland secedes in September or no, there will need...
Thank you for listening to this download of Start the Week, presented by Anne McElvoy.
Hello. King Lear had a modest proposal for dealing with the tensions of power. We have divided in three our kingdom, he declares, to shake all cares and business from our age. It doesn't exactly turn out like that. But what are the lessons from our own history and other cultures for countries toying with dissolving national ties, like Scotland facing its independence vote later this year, or as the Lords broods over the referendum bill, for those tempted to spurn another union, in this case the European one? Round the table to tease apart these disunities are Linda Colley, prize-winning historian, who presents a new Radio 4 series on the rifts and resolutions of UK history; The Times foreign correspondent, David Charter, who's looked at what might await us if we do say adieu to the EU; David Pilling, who's written about another distinctive island and its quirks, Japan in his case; and the academic Maria Delgado, who is, among other things, interested in Catalonia's revived push to say adios to rule from Madrid. Linda, when James VI of Scotland inherited the throne of England in 1603, he argued that geography had preordained political union. Was this just the first? Shakespeare's great rousing patriotic speech was in fact Belgian-born. This seemed in a strange way distressing, possibly with a future role in the European Commission. Maria Delgado, this idea of the island being both isolated but linked by the need to use the sea to connect with other parts of Europe and other parts of the world, how much do you think that influences the idea of culture as well as geopolitics?
Well, I think it's very difficult, as Linda said, to think about culture without thinking about its relationship with the cultures that whatever we think of as Britain has engaged with. If we think about Shakespeare, who's seen as the quintessential English or British dramatist, depends what position you're looking from. I mean, Shakespeare's language is full of resonances of Latin, of Spanish, of Germanic terms. I think it was Borges who talked about him as the most Spanish of writers. And the Irish have often said, actually, Shakespeare, it's a myth, he's English, he's actually Irish. So the ways in which, Shakespeare, somebody we think of as quintessentially English, actually the roots can be traced back to a series of languages and terms that come from beyond the British Isles.
What about modern cultural institutions, though? Because one thing that this discussion does throw up, particularly if we look at possible separation,
need to be fresh thinking either about the UK or about what is left of the UK. So that was what I did at the end of the series, the end of the book.
And as you say throughout the book, and I'm sure we'll explore in the series, there are fictions which arise and then fall, and things are glued back together in different constellations. But these things can still be very important, can't they, to the way that people feel about things. So to your mind, what is more important? Is it geography or history that is destiny here?
Well, I'm a historian, so naturally I would say that history is more important. But it is the case that constitutive stories, as political scientists call them, are an important part of nation building, nation invention. We are not an island kingdom. There are thousands of islands in this particular mass, many of which have very discordant histories. But clearly the idea of being an island kingdom has been a very powerful one, and you can see it, for example, feeding into some UKIP lines of arguments even now. So ideas about, constitutive ideas